Hi, and welcome to this presentation of how to make your dragon. Today, I invite you to take flight with me into this behind the scene where Toothless and the world of Berk emerge from the animated movie into a live-action spectacle. At Framestore, our challenge was to translate these beloved characters into a reality audiences could feel and believe. Working closely with director Dean DeBlois and production VFX Supervisor Christian Mans, our mission was clear: to keep the heart and soul of these dragons alive and create convincing interaction with their Viking riders that would make them truly live. Let me introduce myself. My name is François Lambert. I am the visual effects supervisor at Framestore, based in Montreal, and also the on-set supervisor for the gimbal unit. This project used Autodesk Maya throughout the entire pipeline, with hundreds of animation shots, and therefore it's quite ideal as a collaboration. Framestore served as the sole VFX house for How to Train Your Dragon. We delivered 1,422 shots, crafted 279 assets, created multiple full CG environments, impressive fire-breathing effects, and more. So there would be much to discuss, but I wanted to focus this presentation on what has been our biggest challenge: making some believable flight sequences. Today, I'll be dividing this presentation into 4 topics. First, we'll be talking about designing a flying dragon. Then, we'll talk about crafting the gimbal rig, the physical animatronic puppet. Then we'll talk about the VFX workflow at Framestore, and finish with talking about the finale and some of our final shots. The ultimate goal? Well, to shoot the actor riding Toothless exactly as laid out in the previs, but with enough flexibility for him to act naturally, deliver his line, and give a true performance. It was equal part precision engineering and creative puppeteering, and it worked out pretty well. So let's get started and talk about the concept and visual development of Toothless. Dean always mentioned that the movie needed to have a sense of whimsy, like it's a fantasy world with consequences and a grounded reality. But it's not something as dark, tonally, or visually. And he wanted to preserve that aesthetic to make sure that the movie had a distinct look that could not be confused with other fantasy films. And so there were some early exploration about making Toothless more animal-like, with tests changing the eye's shape and size, for example. But quickly for the filmmakers, there was this decision to stick closer to the original design. Toothless being a very recognizable and beloved creature, there was a real concern it would change its nature too much. And so, although it looked very similar in the model, we did get our inspiration with real animals for the texture, look dev, and animation. So we used some newt and salamander reference for the skin, as you can see here, but black panthers for the body shape and physique. For the wings, we use bats reference. And you can see how similar is the reference to our model. We even used it for the finer details on the wings. As for the scale, we use black lizards references. But to help out with the pattern, we created a Houdini setup for the scale so that we could test out different size and shape. And then, once we were happy with it, we turned it back into the model to get the extra detail. For his expression and familiar toothless smile, we looked at the inside of the mouth of iguanas and snakes. But we also look at mammals like dog's mouth as a reference for the detail on the gums or in the corner of the mouth. So if you see, this is our before, and I'm going to switch to the after. And so these blemishes and little pimples are things that you can see on boxers or other types of dogs. Another aspect of the development is the size of Toothless. In the animated movie version, they freely change his size depending on whether Hiccup is standing next to him or riding him, which is not a flexibility that we have in our VFX world. So we landed on a size that is significantly bigger than the animated version. It's about twice as big. Then a physical puppet was also created to match these proportions and be used on set, which could also be puppeteered as a reference for the actors. And at that point, we did not change the size in the live action version. And so you can see it in action and notice how the size in relation to the people in the shot. So it's quite big. Under the VFX hood, we created a physically correct skeleton and muscle system, complete with a robust rigging. And so even if we kept some of the cartoony features of the character, like the eyes and face, there was lots of attention to grounding the body movements to the likes of big cats. Here's a look at our final asset. One funny thing is that when we built Toothless, we built him with his broken tail, thinking that we would never need to see his original undamaged tail. Later on, we realized there is only one shot in the movie with it, and it is when he's flying against the dark sky as a silhouette, right before he gets shot by Hiccup. And so we had to quickly create a variant of the model with the tail mirrored to the other side. And so, although it might look like the character did not change from our memory of the original version, here's a comparison from the animated movie to our final version. So it's quite different, but although I think it respected and honored the original version. And based on the reaction from the fans, it looks like everyone enjoyed it. Then let's talk about the animation phase. And as our filmmakers said, our reference was always going to be the natural world. And what that means is that if an elephant or a golden eagle, a lion or an iguana could do the move, then we know we could use it and that would work for our animation. And so one of our first development and exploration was to create a flight cycle. And you can notice how we use the same bat reference for the flight cycle. And this first part was important as this would become the base for the gimbal rig in the making. We then rendered these flight cycle with our final model in order to get the approval from our director so that we could move confidently forward with our development. Notice how we slowed it down also to give it more scale and feel heavier. While we're at it, we also created a walk cycle. And we used the same reference of big cats, panthers and such, and also rendered it with our final asset. But above that, above the fact that we want to use some real animals and ground it in reality, there was a will from Dean to retain some of the cuteness of the animated version in his performance. You know, like we need to play up the comedy for some scenes. So Dean and Christian would call those little cinematic conceits because it's also part of filmmaking to create something fantastical. And so we work with the production side animation supervisor, Glenn McIntosh, and Framestore animation supervisor, Kane Garcia, Mina Ibrahim, and Jean Denias on some vignettes. We still use as many references from real live animal in the process. And you can look at the dog that we see in this clip here. And these prove to be quite helpful in finding the balance of performance versus realism. These vignettes were also rendered, and here you can see some early tests of what would become actual shots in the movie. This one is for a scene that we would need later in the Cove sequence where Hiccup and Toothless meets for the first time. So in the How to Train Your Dragon world, each dragon is quite unique in their shapes and behavior. And so vignettes were made for each of the dragons. Another example here for the Deadly Nadder, which is Astrid's dragon. The same animation tests were completed using a real-life bird as reference. And you might find some similarity between the Deadly Nadder and vultures or large exotic birds, which, by the way, was also a reference for the creature's look, dev, and texture. We also use lizards and iguanas to get the colorful and vibrant tones that we can find in nature. Then, with the same render process, we use some moments that would eventually be needed for the scenes in the training arena. But in the process, we would also work out what their fire breath would look like. The Deadly Nadder shoots magnesium fire, which is a touch whiter, brighter, and has some sparkles. So we found some weird references of a guy burning thermite with magnesium strips on top of a car. So it's quite wild, but also a good reference, and our result matched pretty well. We also had to create the massive Red Death, which is, by the way, 3 times bigger in the live action compared to the animated version. Director Dean DeBlois mentioned early on that the design was quite rushed in the animated version. So there was more exploration to be done with the character, changing the skin surface to mimic the rocky formation of Dragon Island, adding a giant crest on the back of the head and also adding a horn on her nose. And so we did all of this and then created this vignette in 2024, while the principal photography was ongoing in Belfast, Ireland. And one day I popped this version of the vignette on my laptop and showed Christian and Dean, and it was an instant wow moment. This vignette ended up making its way into the first director's cut, added from the original previs. Like, it was not planned to be a shot, but I'm happy to report that the slightly different version made its way into the final movie. And so that was quite cool for the team who did the vignette to see their work rewarded this way. So this completes our part 1. Now, let's talk about the special effects gimbal. And in this section, we'll go over some of the challenges, like the limitation of the ramps, and we'll also go through the previs and techvis process. So in the months prior to the shoot, the special effects team started building the gimbal rig in London, based on the size and specification of the CG Toothless model. So under Christian Mann's supervision, we refined the position of the different axis and ram with a close collaboration between all the parties involved. We started by breaking down the model into sections that could be built as an animatronic puppet. So you can see some of the first pass of that split in the upper left corner. The rig was then placed on a moving platform that would become the base of the gimbal, as you can see in the other corners. So this is an early stage of the animatronic puppet. So at this point, while they're building it, we received some of the gimbal blueprints from the special effects team. And then the Framestore VFX team created a CG model matching the measurement of the gimbal, to which we could attach and pin our virtual dragon. Along the way, we had to do multiple adjustments. First, with the way the files were transferred, we needed to make sure that we could convert the animation there and back with a good level of fidelity. And in the end, the special effects team used Blender to read our Maya file and convert them to be played on the physical rig. But we also had to make sure that our measurements were consistent across all models and rig. We also had to take in consideration the limitation of the rams. Exceeding the movement of the body's piston would cause the gimbal to fail and stop. So we adapted a rig to offer a visual representation of when the movement exceeded the ram's capacity to help the animation team. This is where a new department comes into the mix, the previs department. Concurrently to the design and animation part, the Framestore pre-production service team, or FPS, was in full swing. FPS is the department responsible for the pre-visualization work done before the shoot. And there was some discussion about using the animated movie as the previs version. And to be frank, some of the animated version stayed in the previs cut for quite some time as an indication of what needed to be done. But the reality of a live action movie is that it's quite a different medium. The speed of the dragon needed to be slower to convey the scale. The delivery of the actor would be different. Even some action and stunts needed to be toned down and brought into a real physical world. So FPS used our visual effects asset and our flying animation cycle and started to lay out the sequences. And these cuts would inform us which of the action and scene we would need to capture the actor's footage for, and which one could be full CG. And for the purpose of this presentation, I will use a shot from the test drive sequence, as you can see here on the left. You can also see what happens if we attach our newly created section that we are designing for the gimbal rig on the right. Once this step was completed, then another team started converting the previous movement into a TechViz file that could be played on the gimbal. You can see an example here. It's basically taking the movement in space, in 3D space, and then pinning it down to a single point. And so in the process, we would also triangulate what the camera and lighting should be doing if we pivot the entire world from a center point in the middle of the gimbal. This created some funny moments, like in some shot, if we wanted to follow the same as the previous, well, it would make the camera go underground or be in an impossible position. Like there was this one shot where the camera would have to be outside of the studio in order to match what was done in the previous version. So adjustment had to be made along the way. But each and every shot of the movie were transferred this way, roughly around 200 shots for Toothless. These would include an animation file that could be played on the animatronic puppet and a reference chart that you can see here that we could use later on set. The final special effects Toothless made its way to the Belfast studio in early 2024. And there started another battery of tests. This time, we would play these new TechViz files, but also start looking into lighting the scene with Sumo Sky panels, checking with the camera department and such. We spent 3 weeks of prep on set, refining the process until we could get a smooth flight on the gimbal. The movie playing now is one of our first tests, and you can see some of the jittering on the body of the gimbal Toothless. So we needed to fix that. And so during these weeks of prep was a constant flow of animation updates, mostly overnight, but sometimes also during the same day, where I would instruct the Framestore animation team of fixes needed with the animation. Then that had to go back to FPS to get the TechViz update, all the way to the special effects team on set. And as time went, our updates were getting more and more successful. So you can see the jittering is reduced, but there's still a little bit on the head. And then it got a lot more stable. And at that point, they kept asking me if I wanted to try it. And for real, every day they were like, hey, you want to try it? But as this is very experimental at this point, my answer was always the same. I'd rather leave it to the professionals. And this is when we also started to do some tests with the stunt team. So each file could be played at a different speed so that we could incrementally increase the action and make sure everything would be safe. It's just like scaling the curve on an animation file. And typically we would start the test at 50% of the speed, then 75 and up to the 100% with the stunt team for them to approve the cycle to be safe for the actor. As you can see here, we also noticed the position of the neck brace was not optimal for that jockey position. And so we needed to move the handles closer to the head. So we had to involve the props department to make some adjustment. The props department also added the stirrups, those foot pedals, that were mounted on some ramps that would react to the wings movement. So they would go up and down and react to the shoulder of Toothless while he's flying. Here's a look at one of our last fitting and see how smooth the movement is now. So this was taken as we were taking some promotional material for posters and such. But you can see like how smooth the flight is now. Another important detail we needed to be prepared for is that we're dealing with human actors. And therefore, we should include some flexibility to the gimbal. It was also quite important for Christian and Dean. And during that phase, the special effects team included a puppeteering component, or we called it a Waldo. And here you can see that I'm controlling the bottom platform instead of using a TechViz animation file. Then a second one was added for the top portion of the body and head. And you can see the other guy on the right handling the body while I'm moving the bottom platform. But here we're just kind of goofing around with the Monstrous Nightmare. But this would allow our gimbals to be fully automated and play a TechViz animation file. It could be fully puppeted by two guys or a mix of both. So with that in place, we felt we had a robust yet flexible system. Talking about the monstrous nightmare that you can see here, well, we had to go through the process for the other dragons. Although with fewer shots, we had about 20, but nevertheless, since each dragon is unique, they all came with their own sets of complications. For example, the Zippleback, with its two heads, was heavier and needed a bigger setup to pump the fluid into the pistons to make it move. There were also some extra safety needed so that both heads would leave enough space for the actor's legs. The Grunkle, on the other hand, is like a digger. And in the case of Toothless, we wanted to reduce the jittering on the body. But for the Grunkle, we added an extra layer of animation that would shake the gimbal and give it a funny, bouncy movement, which was completely controllable. So in the end, we had two spaces in the Belfast studio from which we could operate two fully complete Toothless gimbal, one Zippleback with the two heads, one digger-like Grunkle, the Deadly Natter, and a Monstrous Nightmare. So total of 5 dragons. But how does that work once we started rehearsing on set? How did it go on a daily basis? Well, what we found at that stage is that it's actually quite hard to use the pre-recorded files. Like the camera could not move as fast as the TechViz, or then the timing of the gimbal would be off, or the actor would need to say his line at a very specific second and for a set amount of time in order to hit the mark. It took a lot of the fluidity out, and it became quite robotic and regimented. So our best setup would be to use the pre-recorded file on the base platform only. This would give the nice flight cycle movement that matched our animation, but use the Waldo, the puppeteer component, for the body and the head, so that we could have it move more naturally for the actors. And it would also provide some much needed creative space for Dean to direct the actors. For example, if Toothless needs to dive after a comment from Hiccup, then the actor could deliver his line, "Let's go, Toothless," and then the gimbal puppeteer could have him dive right after the comment. So we moved forward with this approach and used only a handful of pre-recorded files. So each and every one of these shots were carefully crafted by the gimbal unit. This was a balancing act. We had to coordinate Framestore VFX, the FPS TechViz team, special effects, the stunt departments, the props department, you name it, and get everyone speaking the same language. And in just 3 weeks of prep and about 4 weeks of shooting, we fine-tuned everything from the saddles and stirrups to the rein system, even while laying out some complex camera move and lighting setups with the Sumo Sky panel. And we captured close to 220 plates. Talking about plates, well, here's the plate from the same test drive shot that we've used earlier. That completes our part 2. So let's move out to the next part of this presentation, the VFX workflow. Now that we have this footage, well, it's time to head back to Framestore Studio. And our first step was to start with FPS, the Framestore pre-production service team, but this time for a post-viz pass. So the post-viz is essentially using the pre-viz, the pre-visualization, but this time we're adding a crude extraction of the character. So at that point, there might be some need to adjust the timing of the animated Toothless to match the performance better. There might also need some timing adjustment with the cut, so everything goes to the editing room. And this will reshape the sequence and become our turnover cut. So here's the post-viz from the same shot of the test-derived sequence. At that point, we know the only thing that we're going to keep from this is Hiccup, which is the hero character, for those who are not familiar with the franchise, and possibly the saddle. While this process is underway on the Framestore VFX side, we are busy with camera tracking. And you can see here that although the movement of Toothless seems to be rotating around the y-axis, he's doing a 180 degree, as he's turning. The camera on set seems to be rotating around the x-axis. And that's all due to the fact that the gimbal is bolted on the ground. And the rotation is limited by the capacity of the rams. We could only rotate the gimbal about 30 degrees each way. So the camera is doing most of the work. But thanks to our tech viz that we had on set and the tech viz chart, then we can see how we planned for it and how it ended up being made in the end. And you can see that it's quite close. It was a good representation of what the camera needed to do on set. Next came the match move of the gimbal and the character. So at that point, we are tracking the CG gimbal model, but we swapped the top part for a LiDAR of Toothless in order to get a closer match. And then we can match move the body of the character, the body of Hiccup, using our CG version of the character. The process at that point moves to the layout department, where a conform is created. It's like a CG representation matching precisely the plate's position. So it's worth noting that all this part was taken care in Autodesk Maya from the beginning of that previous pipeline all the way to this moment, which was an integral part of the setup. So it's a complex succession of rigs and dependencies cascading from the top of the pipeline all the way to a file that the animation team can use to perform their task. The process at that point is a complete round trip from the original previous idea all the way to a workable conform. By the way, this conform was non-destructive. Our dev team was able to create a system from which we could replace files, like an updated match move, without destroying the rest of the dependencies. So now that we can move on to animation, the animator can give Toothless its performance with the conform in place so that they can attach the plate Hiccup to Toothless and have some flexibility with it. Let's take a look at some of the other shots of the movie, and this time from the finale. So you can see here the different dragons in action. On the left, we have our Gronko, and you can see some of that extra bounciness that we're getting from our shaky animation file and gimbal. On the Zipple back, we were able to separate the two heads thanks to our conform that provided some extra flexibility so that they could be integrated with each their own conform. And the Monstrous Nightmare, can see that we had quite a good connection from the hands of Snotlout, the rider, to the horns of the creature, which was something that we had to solve also along the way. But the process of capturing the actors to the match move, the conform, the layout, and the animation remained the same for all creatures. For the Deadly Nadder, some of her most complex connections were due to the ropes that she's holding. For most shot, we would use the rope that she's holding in between her hand, the Astrid, the character, but we would replace the rest in CG. It's the same for the rope stirrup, those ropes that she has for her foot. So it added some extra complexity for the CFX department. For this one, we also had the additional rider, so there's two people riding for this part of the sequence. So it's double the match move and complication to sit both of them on the creature. You can see that we replaced Hiccup's leg for a CG one to fit better, in this case, with the ladder. So this is the shot. So that was one of our most complex gimbal work. This shot is 30 seconds long, and it's circling around Red Dead. And for this, we had 3 different scans with each their own camera and match move, combined with some CG takeovers as some of the scans transferred to CG double along the way. So this shot was in production for about 10 months from the turnover to final completion in order to solve all the different challenges that we had to face. On the subject of challenges, well, let me segue into some more fun facts about Red Death. Red Death is a massive kaiju-style dragon, very different from the other ones that we had to build. She is 313 meters long and has a wingspan of 370 meters. And to make her move, she had 280 simulated muscles. And yeah, I keep referring it to she, because yes, she's a girl. She's the queen of the dragons. The asset contained one default model and 3 unique variants. One for the head, for a scene where Snotlout slides from the forehead. Then we had one for the close-up of the eye, where you can see Snotlout bash it with a hammer, and you can even see some goo flying from the impact. And one for the inside of the mouth. And in that part of the sequence, Astrid can be seen falling inside of her mouth and smashing some teeth. For that variant, we had 477 hand plates too, some that needed to move freely in order to match the plate's photography from shot to shot. Our fire breath comes from a rocket ship reference. And so you can see here the reference material that we matched in our FX simulation. And pay close attention to this second shot right there of that rocket ship reference. And now I'm gonna play our final shot. And once you know that, you'll see the resemblance. And so what we're looking at here is a breakdown of one of our first shots that we completed for the trailer. It also served as the hero shot to define our powerful fire breath. And it matches pretty well with the reference. On the subject of fire, another particular challenge of the fire breath was that it needed to be controlled. And the path of the fire is part of the story. So in the air battle, she fires and lights up the sky on fire. So in order to achieve that, we created a string in Maya that the animator could use to animate the head and be able to see the trajectory of the fire. You can see that in the upper left square. Then we would send this string to FX and create a representation of what the coverage of the fire would be with a lower res render that you can see on the upper right square. We called it the Cheeto because it's orange and it looks like the tasty treat. But it since the movement of the head would also direct the position of the string, we could preemptively adjust the animation and coverage instead of having to go to an expensive fire effects render. And this saved us quite some time. So here's the final shot. Another fun fact that our CG Soup came up with is that for the 140 seconds she spends flying in the air battle sequence, he figured that the amount of energy to stay in the air would require about 80 million calories. And to consume that many calories, she would need to eat roughly 600 adult sheep. All right, I'm kidding. This part is made up, but it's important to have fun too. Huh? Can't be all work all the time. So what does it take to make a dragon fly? Well, it takes artistry, it takes technology, it takes engineers, animators, performers, and dreamers working in perfect sync to bring magic to life. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.